Hello, everyone. Welcome back as we explore the politics of Latin America and the Caribbean. This week, we'll be focusing on the military in politics across the region. I am Dr. Nicole Warmington Granston. So, what we'll be covering this week basically is discussing how political instability and decay under democratically elected governments resulted in military coups and the establishment of military rule. Then we're going to look at what are some of the lasting effects of military rule across Latin American politics. And then, of course, we'll determine or discuss whether or not Latin American countries may ever find themselves under military rule once more. When we think about why did the military intervene in Latin American politics, we know that military intervention in Latin America was generally justified or has been justified as a response to social polarization, economic crisis, and perceived political radicalization. We find that armed forces presented themselves as guardian of order, stability, and elite interests when civilian governments appeared unable to manage conflict or growth. To govern, most military regimes adopted bureaucratic authoritarianism, which is basically, according to O'Donnell, an oligarchic dictatorship where power flows top-down through hierarchical bureaucracies. It tended to have a three-tiered structure. At the top, number one was a ruling elite, which was made up of military leaders and economic elites, followed by technocrats, who were the policy designers and managers, and then at the bottom, the general population that were excluded from participation and decision-making. Overall, we know that military rule was not chaotic. It was actually highly organized and technocratic. Latin America actually went through two eras of military rule. The first was the democratic deficit and dictatorship era between the 1930s and 40s, and the second was the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes of the 1960s and 1980s. During the first era, as we said, the democratic deficit and dictatorship era of the 1930s and 40s, we found that after independence, Latin American countries adopted democratic constitutions modeled on the United States and France. But democratic political culture lagged behind institutional design. In moments of crisis, leaders reverted to authoritarian crisis. The Great Depression actually devastated export economies and discredited civilian elites. Combined with ideological influence of European fascism, this actually made military rule appear legitimate to many sections of society. Between the 1930 and 1933, military coups occurred across the region, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Central America, and Cuba. The major paradox of this, though, was that although authoritarian, we found that in this period there was also expanded state intervention, using particularly import in substitution industrialization, or ISI. It actually helped to strengthen the working class organization. It opened up space for populism, and it even extended suffrage in several countries, including women's voting rights. After this era, we did actually see democracy resurge. Following World War II and the defeat of fascism, many Latin American countries attempted democratic renewal. The US alliance, as well as the post-war optimism, contributed to this trend. The notable exception in this period, though, was Costa Rica. They actually abolished the military altogether, which insulated that country from future coups, and they actually had created a stable democratic system as a result. Other countries, namely Venezuela, Chile, Uruguay, and Colombia, they experienced partial democratic advances, though authoritarianism never fully disappeared. What we saw in this period between the 1940s and 60s is that there was a strengthening of democratic norms, but it did not consolidate democracy. Now, as we moved on to the bureaucratic authoritarian regime, we found that following that military rule returned more forcibly during the Cold War. And this was due to, one, US-backed anti-communism in the region, the region's national security doctrine, fear of leftist revolutions, particularly after Cuba, economic crises and the decline of the effectiveness of import substitution industrialization, or ISI, and there's a rising labor militancy and inflation. We found that these regimes ruled a great deal across Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The key characteristics of this bureaucratic authoritarian regime was as follows: the suppression of political parties and legislatures, control of wages, unions and labor rights, severe restrictions on civil liberties, the use of torture, imprisonment and assassination, as well as the state terror as a governing strategy. Economically, it should be noted that these regimes reintegrated national economies into the global capitalism. They actually helped to promote foreign investment and multinational corporations from in coming into the region, and they really relied a great deal on US trained economies, for instance the Chicago boys in Chile. So what we find in this particular era is that economic rationalization came at a cost of democracy and human rights. Now, what was the relationship like between the United States and those that practiced military rule in Latin America? One thing we note generally is that the US largely supported or tolerated military regimes as Cold War allies, prioritizing anti-communism over democracy. It should be noted, though, that the Carter administration did criticize these military regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean for their human rights abuses. But under the Reagan administration, they reversed course and supported all these right-wing dictatorships and counterinsurgencies within the region. Example, how it is that they supported this type of dictatorship in Nicaragua. What we find is that this actually damaged US credibility as a promoter of democracy in the region. Now, what were the lasting effects of the bureaucratic authoritarianism in Latin America, or just general military rule? Is that we find that military authoritarianism has left deep scars. It has resulted in weak political parties, distrust of democratic institutions, the normalization of executive dominance, trauma from widespread human rights abuses, persistent civil-military tensions as the main scars or effects of military rule. We did see, though, that while most countries transitioned to democracy in the 1980s and 1990s, democracy remains incomplete and fragile across the region. Now, the question that most people have is, what does the future hold with regards to the military rule in politics? Now, generally, what we see is, when discussing whether or not the military rule could return in the 21st century, is that we find that military rule is less probable in this era of the 21st century. That while it's less probable or even less common, there's things that still stand out. We know that democratic norms compete with authoritarian traditions. Constitutions are not always respected due to crises. The military still retains political capacity, except in Costa Rica, and public tolerance of emergency rules still persists. So while it is likely improbable, it is still possible because of these four things. So the conclusion that we can come to is that Latin American democracy is procedural, but not fully consolidated, because it has been shaped by a long history of military intervention. So the main takeaway I wanted to have with regards to the military in Latin America is that military rule in Latin America emerged not as an aberration, but as a recurring response to crisis, producing order and economic restructuring at the expense of democracy, participation, and human rights. Thank you.